In the last lesson, we explored the concepts of what GraphQL brings to the development world. Well, here I've actually set up a little playground for you to interact with a different database from the Firestore database that you've built so that you can see what it's like to actually make requests against a GraphQL server for the data that you're used to using already inside of your Crown Clothing application. Now, all you gotta do in order to access this playground is simply go to https://www.crown/clothing.com. I've set up this playground with a GraphQL server for you to play against so that you can see and make queries against it to actually get a live example of what it's like to actually use the GraphQL library. I'm gonna actually directly demonstrate to you what it's like to write a query for our collections data. Now, let's actually remove this so that we can write one from scratch ourselves. The first thing that we need to know, as we see from this comment, is that there are two types of things we can request, right? We can either make a query for some data, or we can make a mutation to modify some data. But we don't want to make any modifications because, again, so many students are going to end up using this database. We want to not have any data that is inconsistent so that different students have different experiences. Instead, we're just going to make queries to request data. But I'll show you how to make mutations on the front end in a few lessons from now. Now, with our query, we have to first tell GraphQL that we're making a query. And we do that literally by writing the query keyword. And what's really great about this playground is that it actually helps you with this autocomplete feature. So if you're trying to type something, it will try and guess what it is that you want. And at the same time, it will also let you know if what you're asking for does not exist. And what do I mean by this? Well, inside of our query, there are only certain things that we have access to that are defined by our database as the kind of data objects that we're allowed to get. Now, our server that I've set up for you guys only holds collections and the items inside of those collections. So those will be the things that we see here, as well as the collections themselves that represent the things that hold the items inside of them. And what we're going to do is we are actually going to hit this little schema tab on the side here. This schema tab will tell you what properties are on what objects that you are able to access. So let's look at the collection object first. On this collection object, here it will define to you the shape of the data that you have access to. And every GraphQL playground that you interact with will have this for you because you need to be able to see it. This is actually set up through a different library called Prisma. And this is pretty much just a little tool that allows us on the front end to visualize the data. And Prisma is a very, very popular tool on the back end that gives us access to this playground. But other tools will also have this if you're working with a backend GraphQL server that is built on something similar. Because on the front end, we need to know the shape of the data we might be requesting so that we know what we can request for. Now, here I'm going to walk you through what this looks like. So the type defines the type of objects that are available. So here, for example, is a type object called collection. On this collection, you'll see this ID, and then you'll see this type of ID. And what this means is that it's actually just a type that exists on the backend, specific to GraphQL, meaning that it is an identifier that must be unique. If you see this exclamation mark, it means that this field is mandatory, meaning that it will always be there if this collection object exists in the backend. So this is just one property we can query for. We can query for IDs. There's a title property, which is a string, which is exactly the same string type that we've seen on our front end in JavaScript. And this is also necessary. Now here what you'll see is this property called items. And this items points to an array as indicated by the square boxes. And inside are items. items being this next type, right? So here we have a type collection. Well, then there's also another object type called item, meaning that this item's property will always be an array of items, and the items are necessary. So there must be items inside of this array. And this next bang after the array means that there will always be an array as the value of our item's property. The item object itself has an ID as well, a name that's a string, a price that's a float. Float being very similar to the same float object type that we have in JavaScript, which is a decimal integer value. So integers are whole numbers, floats are numbers that have decimal places. That's all it is. Image URL is a string, and then collection, which is the owner of this item, is a collection. So this collection points to this collection. Now you might be wondering why there's no exclamation mark here. Well, there's no exclamation mark because in the backend definition, it's just the way that if you were to delete these items, you also don't delete the collection. It's a nuanced thing about the server of writing backend GraphQL servers that you don't really need to worry about, but that's the main reason why this bang is not here. Finally, here we have these types called queries. And the query is similar to the same query that we asked for. And what it allows us to do, it defines the type of things we can ask for. So here we can ask for all of the collections, right, as our query. And what we can expect it to give us back is an array of collections. These collection items, these same ones. Now, there's also our ability to ask for a collection by the ID of the collection. So if we know the ID of the collection, well, we can get back a collection object, right? A specific collection object where that ID matches the ID that we passed into it. Now, if the ID does not exist, it won't give us back a collection. And that's why you see there's no exclamation mark, because it cannot guarantee that it will give us back a collection if the ID does not actually exist as an ID of an object. So that's why there's no bang here. And that's how you read this schema when you actually look at this if you ever interact with another GraphQL database. Finally, there's this unique query that we have access to, which is called getCollectionByTitle, which, similar to the ID, it allows us to pass this title to it, which will be a string, and what we'll get back is a collection object. Now, this is also something that must be written on the backend server. So whatever you see that you have access to is what the person who wrote the backend server wants you to be able to access. So this schema is going to be defined by the person writing your backend server. So if you don't see certain things, it just means that your person that wrote your backend server doesn't want you to get access to it, or they made a mistake and you can request them to do so, to give you that stuff. So this is just something that you need to keep in mind about working with GraphQL. So again, this is a very, very extensive workflow in order for us to work with GraphQL. Now that you've understood this schema, I'm going to show you how we can actually query for collections. So let's actually use this query collection. Well, it's simply just say that I want collections. And then we always have to add these brackets around what the specific request we want is. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper look about it as well, but it's just something you kind of have to get used to as far as where these actual brackets will go. But inside, we're going to define the properties that we want when we get back our collections object. So off of this thing, I want the ID because I know I can get it, and I want the title. So for now, let's just get that. If you hit this play button, you'll see the request get made, and we get back an object with a data property. And that data property actually points to our collections. So this collections object comes back to us as an array. And each object inside is the specific different collection objects that we have stored in our database. And here you'll see that they look pretty much exactly like the things that we had already been using with inside of our backend. There's an ID, and then the title is either hats, jackets, men's, sneakers, women's. These are the objects that we work with. Now, if I wanted the items as well, as I know from my schema, I know that I can query for the items property. And I'll get back an array of the items. So here I'm just going to say I want the items. And then on the items, if we see this little red tag, it actually tells us something. We must have a selection of subfields, right? So did you mean, and then you see that red tag asking us to add properties to this item. Well, here we can now add the fields of what the items that we want are. So this is an important thing to note. If you want this field, you must specify the subfields, meaning the properties that you also want on these objects that you get back inside of this subcollection of this property items. So what I want is the ID, I want the name, I want the price, right? And that's it. I don't want the image URL. Let's just say that I just want the actual data for some reason. I hit play. And here you'll see that I get back those objects, except now I get this new items property as well, pointing to the array of the objects that I want. If I want the image URL, I can simply just put it here. So I can put this property actually anywhere. The order that you put these properties does not matter, but it will be the order that they show up in the object, which is really not significant, but it's just something that maybe you want to keep in mind. So once we do this, if I hit play again, you'll see that now I have our image URL associated to the item object I'm getting back as well. And this is pretty much making our first query. That's all it really is. It's just like writing a JSON object, giving it the shape of the data that we want, and then expecting our server to give it back to us. And with the playground, because we get this autocomplete feature, these warnings, as well as access to the schema, right, which tells us what we have access to, it's really easy for us to figure out what data we need to get or have access to from the backend server. Now, in the next lesson, let's keep playing around with this playground so we have a better understanding of what else we can do. So I will see you in the next lesson.